November 23rd, 1998. When The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time released in North America, it didn't just meet expectations, it redefined what video games could be. Within days, it received perfect scores from publications that had never given them before. Famitsu awarded it 40 out of 40, making it the first game ever to achieve that honor. Critics declared it the greatest game of all time. But here's the question that matters in 2025. When players strip away the nostalgia, when they compare Ocarina of Time's innovations to everything that's been built on its foundation over the past 27 years, does the game's revolutionary design still hold up, or have the very systems it pioneered been refined so much by later games that the original feels dated by comparison? To understand what Ocarina of Time accomplished, context matters. In 1998, 3D gaming was still figuring itself out. Super Mario 64 had released 2 years earlier, proving that three-dimensional gameplay could work, but each new 3D game faced fundamental design challenges that had no established solutions. How do players target enemies when depth perception is difficult on a 2D screen? How do game designers create intuitive controls when there are only so many buttons on a controller? How do developers build combat systems that feel precise when the camera constantly shifts perspectives? These weren't theoretical questions, they were practical problems that made many early 3D games frustrating to play. Ocarina of Time's development team, led by 5 directors, including Eiji Aonuma and Yoshiaki Koizumi under producer Shigeru Miyamoto, spent over 3 years solving these problems. The game began development in 1994 alongside Super Mario 64 and was originally planned for the Nintendo 64 DD disk drive peripheral. When the 64 DD faced development delays, Nintendo moved Ocarina of Time to a standard cartridge, eventually creating a 32-megabyte game, the largest cartridge Nintendo had produced at that time. The solution that became Z-targeting emerged from an unlikely source, a field trip to Toei Kyoto Studio Park, a theme park attached to a film studio. According to Yoshiaki Koizumi in an interview with former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata, the team visited the park to observe staged sword fights. Koizumi wanted to understand how Chanbara-style sword combat could work in Ocarina of Time. What caught his attention wasn't the choreography, it was the artificial structure. In these staged performances, a lone hero would defeat 20 opponents, but the trick was simple. The enemies didn't swarm simultaneously. They waited their turn, attacking one at a time while others stood by. This observation became the foundation for Z-targeting. When players press the Z button in Ocarina of Time, several things happen simultaneously. Link locks onto a targeted enemy or object, the camera shifts to follow that target, and Link constantly faces toward it. Other enemies in the area stop attacking aggressively, effectively taking turns, just like those stage fighters. The system solved multiple problems at once. It gave players precise control in 3D space, it made combat manageable when outnumbered, and it eliminated the need for manual camera adjustment during fights. Toru Osawa, another team member who attended that field trip, noticed something different. When samurai caught chains and wrapped them around their arms, combatants moved in an arc while maintaining distance, the same circular strafing movement Link performs when Z-targeting. Both observations became core to the system's design. Z-targeting was revolutionary enough that it influenced essentially every 3D action game developed afterward. Former Rockstar Games vice president Dan Houser stated in 2012 that anyone making 3D games who claims they haven't borrowed from Mario or Zelda on Nintendo 64 is lying. Dark Souls creator Hidetaka Miyazaki said The Legend of Zelda became a textbook for 3D action games. The lock-on systems in Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, God of War, and countless other modern titles all trace their lineage directly back to Ocarina of Time's Z-targeting. But here's where the comparison gets interesting. Those modern lock-on systems have refined the concept significantly. They're smoother, more responsive, and offer more granular control. The question isn't whether Ocarina of Time invented lock-on targeting, it definitively did, but whether its implementation still feels good compared to what came after. Playing Ocarina of Time in 2025 reveals both the brilliance of the original design and its age. The Z-targeting system works, but the camera can feel stiff compared to modern games. When not Z-targeting, the camera requires manual adjustment using the C buttons, and it sometimes struggles in tight spaces or near walls. This wasn't considered a flaw in 1998. It was considered remarkable that a 3D game's camera functioned this well at all. but players accustomed to modern camera systems that smoothly track action and automatically adjust to avoid obstructions might find Ocarina of Time's camera frustrating. The 3DS remake in 2011 improved camera controls using the handheld's gyroscope, acknowledging that even Nintendo recognized the original camera system needed updating.
Z-targeting also reveals an interesting limitation when replayed today. Because the system was designed around targeting one enemy at a time, combat against multiple foes requires constantly switching targets. This works as intended, it's part of the design philosophy, but it can feel restrictive compared to modern games that allow players to freely engage multiple enemies without locking on to anyone. Games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom use a modernized targeting system that feels less rigid, allowing players to lock on when they want precision or fight freely when they prefer fluidity. The original Z-targeting accomplishes its goals perfectly for 1998, but it's a solution built for hardware limitations that no longer exist. The other major innovation Ocarina of Time pioneered was context-sensitive controls, specifically the A button. In most games before Ocarina of Time, each button had a fixed function. Jump was always jump, attack was always attack. Ocarina of Time's A button did everything. It opened doors, climbed ladders, talked to NPCs, rolled, pushed blocks, pulled blocks, picked up objects, threw objects, read signs, opened chests, and mounted Epona. An on-screen prompt showed players what the A button would do in any given situation, and the action changed based on Link's position and what objects were nearby. This context sensitivity extended beyond just the A button. It permeated the entire control scheme. Link would automatically jump when running off ledges, eliminating the need for a dedicated jump button and solving the problem of mistimed jumps that plagued platformers. Miyamoto removed a dedicated jump button specifically to make Ocarina of Time less action-focused and emphasize puzzles and exploration. This design choice meant players never had to worry about whether they were positioned correctly to jump a gap. If they ran toward a ledge at the right angle, Link would leap across automatically. The game interpreted player intent rather than requiring pixel-perfect inputs. According to interviews, the team had briefly experimented with first-person perspective during development, which would have made many interactions easier from a technical standpoint, but character designer Yusuke Nakano insisted Link remain visible on screen because Link looks cool. This commitment to third-person perspective made context-sensitive controls essential. Without them, the control scheme would have been too complicated. The brilliance of context-sensitive controls becomes apparent when examining how ubiquitous they've become. The parkour system in Assassin's Creed, context-sensitive controls interpreting whether players want to climb, vault, or jump based on environmental proximity. The cover system in Gears of War, context-sensitive controls recognizing when players are near cover and automatically taking position. The seamless interactions in games like The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, and God of War, all variations on the context-sensitive control philosophy Ocarina of Time established. The game popularized the idea that buttons don't need fixed functions, they should adapt to what the player is trying to do. But like Z-targeting, context-sensitive controls show their age when compared to modern implementations. Ocarina of Time's context sensitivity sometimes misreads player intent. Standing near a block, players might want to climb it, but if they're not angled correctly, Link pushes it instead. Near a ledge, players might intend to simply walk to the edge, but Link automatically jumps if they're moving too quickly. These aren't frequent problems, but they happen often enough that modern quality-of-life standards would fix them. Contemporary games use more sophisticated detection systems that better distinguish between similar actions and give players more agency over which context-sensitive action they want to perform. The dungeon design in Ocarina of Time represents another area where the game's innovations remain impressive but have been surpassed. Each dungeon follows a clear structure. Enter the dungeon, navigate interconnected rooms while solving environmental puzzles, acquire a special item partway through that becomes essential for progression, use that item to access previously unreachable areas, collect a boss key, and defeat a boss that requires mastery of the dungeon's signature item. This formula existed in previous Zelda games, but Ocarina of Time translated it into 3D space with remarkable elegance. The Forest Temple exemplifies this design philosophy.
Players progress through a twisted atmospheric structure where paintings contain Poe sisters who must be defeated in sequence. The fairy bow, acquired midway through, enables players to hit distant switches and defeat enemies from range. The dungeon's layout requires spatial reasoning in 3 dimensions, tracking which rooms connect, remembering which doors are locked, visualizing how the dungeon's structure fits together. The boss, Phantom Ganon, requires using the fairy bow in a creative way, shooting energy orbs back at him before engaging in sword combat.
Compared to modern dungeon design, Ocarina of Time's dungeons are remarkably linear. Players have some freedom in the order they tackle objectives, but the overall path through each dungeon is predetermined. Item acquisition gates progression explicitly. Without the fairy bow, certain areas remain inaccessible. This creates satisfying puzzle-solving moments, but also means players who get stuck have limited options. Modern games tend toward more open-ended dungeon design, where players can attempt objectives in varied orders and use different tools to solve the same problem. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom abandoned this structure entirely, giving Link all his core abilities from the start and designing challenges around creative tool usage rather than specific item requirements. The question becomes whether Ocarina of Time's more structured dungeon design represents a weakness or simply a different philosophy. Some players prefer the guided experience, where each dungeon teaches specific mechanics and ensures everyone has similar experiences to discuss. Others find the linear structure restrictive compared to modern open-ended designs. Neither perspective is wrong, they represent different priorities. What remains undeniable is that Ocarina of Time's dungeons were meticulously crafted spatial puzzles that required 3-dimensional thinking, and in 1998, that was groundbreaking. Ocarina of Time's puzzles themselves represent another area where opinions vary on whether they've aged well. Some puzzles remain clever and satisfying, bombing cracked walls to reveal hidden passages, using the hookshot to cross gaps, reflecting light with the mirror shield to activate switches. These puzzles feel intuitive and reward observation. Other puzzles rely on conventions that feel dated. The Water Temple famously frustrated players with its requirement to constantly pause, enter the menu, equip and unequip the iron boots to sink and float. This wasn't a puzzle challenge, it was interface tedium. The 3DS remake addressed this by making the iron boots assignable to a button, acknowledging the original design was unnecessarily cumbersome. Some puzzles also suffer from obtuse solutions that modern design standards would clarify. Playing the Song of Time near certain blocks makes them disappear, but nothing in the environment indicates which blocks respond to this song versus regular bombs. Players discover this through trial and error or outside knowledge. The Fire Temple contains a puzzle where players must hammer a statue's face, but the visual cue distinguishing interactive statues from decorative ones is subtle. These puzzles aren't poorly designed, they reflect design conventions of the era when games expected players to experiment extensively and accept occasional frustration. Modern games prioritize clear communication and rarely require players to guess solutions through exhaustive trial and error. The soundtrack, composed primarily by Koji Kondo, remains one of Ocarina of Time's most timeless elements. The game's music adapts dynamically to gameplay, shifting between exploration and combat themes seamlessly. Each location has a distinctive musical identity. Kokiri Forest's peaceful woodwinds, Hyrule Field's adventurous orchestral theme, the Water Temple's haunting underwater ambience, Ganon's castle's oppressive organ. The ocarina songs themselves, Zelda's Lullaby, Saria's Song, the Song of Storms, became iconic melodies recognizable even to non-players. Kondo's compositions elevated every moment, using music to communicate emotion and atmosphere in ways that made the game feel cinematic despite limited graphics. The dynamic music system in Ocarina of Time influenced how video game soundtracks function. Rather than simply playing tracks on loop, the game's music responds to player actions, transitioning smoothly between different versions of themes based on context. This adaptive approach became standard in adventure games. While modern games have more sophisticated audio technology and can implement more complex musical systems, Ocarina of Time's soundtrack still resonates because of the quality of its composition. Technology advances, but melody and emotional impact are timeless. Playing the game today, the music remains as effective as it was in 1998. The pacing and progression structure in Ocarina of Time demonstrates masterful game design that remains relevant. The game begins in Kokiri Forest, a small, safe area where players learn basic controls and mechanics without pressure. Link explores the forest, talks to villagers, and approaches the Great Deku Tree for the first dungeon, a gentle introduction that teaches combat, Z-targeting, and puzzle solving in a controlled environment. After completing this tutorial dungeon, the game opens into Hyrule Field, a vast hub connecting all regions. This moment, stepping out of Kokiri Forest into the open expanse of Hyrule Field for the first time, became one of gaming's most memorable experiences. The game had prepared players for this transition, giving them competence in basic mechanics before confronting them with scale and possibility. The time skip to adult Link 7 years later demonstrates even more sophisticated pacing. Players have spent hours as child Link, becoming familiar with Hyrule's geography and characters.
When Link draws the Master Sword and awakens 7 years in the future, Hyrule has transformed. Locations that were safe are now dangerous. NPCs players knew have aged or disappeared. The Castletown market, once bustling, is now filled with re-deads. This stark contrast creates emotional impact. Players see directly how Ganondorf's rise to power corrupted the kingdom. The game uses time travel not just as a story device, but as a gameplay mechanic that fundamentally alters the world and how players interact with it. Comparing this pacing structure to modern open-world games reveals different philosophies. Games like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring give players freedom immediately, allowing them to explore wherever they want from the beginning. This creates exciting discovery, but can overwhelm players who don't have clear objectives. Ocarina of Time uses a hub-and-spoke structure, where Hyrule Field connects distinct regions players visit in a suggested sequence. This provides guided progression while maintaining exploration elements. Neither approach is superior, they serve different design goals. What makes Ocarina of Time's pacing notable is how deliberately it teaches mechanics, expands the world, and maintains momentum across a 25-30-hour adventure. The quality of life features players take for granted in modern games are largely absent from Ocarina of Time. There's no fast travel until late in the game, when players learn warp songs that transport them to specific locations. Before that, traveling between regions requires riding Epona or running through Hyrule Field repeatedly. There's no quest log tracking objectives. Players must remember what they're supposed to do or refer to Navi's occasional hints. The inventory system requires pausing to change equipment, which becomes tedious during puzzles requiring frequent item swapping. The game has limited save points initially, though warp songs eventually allow saving from anywhere. These aren't oversights, they reflect design priorities of the era. In 1998, the journey between locations was part of the experience. Crossing Hyrule Field on horseback, watching the sunset, hearing the music swell, this was atmospheric immersion, not wasted time. The lack of a quest log meant players paid attention to dialogue and learned through exploration rather than following waypoints. The limited save points created stakes and encouraged careful progression. But in 2025, after decades of quality of life improvements across the industry, these systems can feel unnecessarily restrictive. Players accustomed to modern convenience features might find Ocarina of Time's lack of them frustrating. The camera limitations extend beyond combat. The game uses manual camera control, where players adjust the view using C buttons, and the camera often doesn't cooperate in confined spaces. The Temple of Time's narrow corridors, the Water Temple's cramped rooms, and various dungeon passages all present situations where the camera gets stuck or provides poor angles. Modern games use sophisticated camera systems with collision detection that automatically adjusts when near walls or obstacles. Ocarina of Time's camera can clip through geometry or get caught on objects, breaking immersion. This was acceptable in 1998 when all 3D games struggled with cameras, but it stands out negatively compared to contemporary standards. The combat system, while innovative for introducing Z-targeting, is relatively simple compared to modern action games. Link has basic attacks: horizontal slashes, vertical slashes, stabs, and jump attacks. Enemies have predictable patterns that players learn and counter. There's no deep combo system, no parry mechanics with complex timing windows, no varied move sets depending on equipped weapons.
The combat serves the adventure design perfectly. It's challenging enough to require attention without being so difficult it overshadows exploration and puzzle solving. But players coming from games like Dark Souls, Sekiro, or God of War might find the combat shallow. Those games built upon Ocarina of Time's foundation, but added layers of complexity that create moment-to-moment depth Ocarina of Time lacks. This raises the fundamental question: should Ocarina of Time be judged as a game to play in 2025, or as a historical artifact demonstrating innovation? The answer depends on perspective. As a game to experience cold without context, Ocarina of Time shows its age in numerous ways. The graphics, while charming, are crude by modern standards. Low polygon models, blurry textures, limited draw distance causing fog effects. The frame rate, locked at 20 frames per second on Nintendo 64, feels choppy compared to modern games running at 60 FPS or higher. The controls, while innovated for their time, lack the refinement of systems built upon their foundation. The quality of life features players expect simply don't exist. But as a historical artifact and piece of game design innovation, Ocarina of Time's importance cannot be overstated. The game solved fundamental problems that allowed 3D action-adventure games to flourish. It established design conventions, lock-on targeting, context-sensitive controls, hub world structure, dynamic music, seamless 3D combat that became industry standards. Developers worldwide studied Ocarina of Time to understand how to make 3D games work. The game's influence appears in Grand Theft Auto 3, which director Sam Houser described as Zelda meets Goodfellas. It influenced the Legacy of Kain series, the Okami series, the Dark Souls series, and countless others. When examining modern 3D adventure games, Ocarina of Time's DNA is everywhere. The distinction between influence and enjoyment matters. Ocarina of Time influenced the industry more than almost any other game in history. Its innovations became the foundation modern games are built upon. But that doesn't mean playing it today provides the same experience as playing contemporary games that refined its systems over decades. Someone playing Ocarina of Time for the first time in 2025 might appreciate its accomplishments intellectually while finding the actual gameplay experience less satisfying than modern titles. This isn't a failure of Ocarina of Time, it's the natural result of progress. The game's innovations were so successful that every subsequent game improved upon them, making the original feel dated by comparison. This phenomenon isn't unique to Ocarina of Time. Super Mario 64 pioneered 3D platforming, but feels imprecise compared to Super Mario Odyssey. The original Half-Life revolutionized first-person shooter storytelling, but feels clunky compared to modern narrative FPS games. Resident Evil 4 transformed third-person action, but lacks the polish of its successors. These games are all historically important and worthy of recognition, but playing them today requires accepting dated elements in exchange for experiencing their innovations firsthand. What makes Ocarina of Time special among these innovators is how much of its design remains elegant. The dungeon layouts are still cleverly constructed spatial puzzles. The progression pacing still feels deliberate and satisfying. The music still evokes emotion. The story beats, meeting Princess Zelda as a child, drawing the Master Sword, witnessing Hyrule's corruption, the final confrontation with Ganon, still carry weight. The game's core design philosophy prioritizes player experience over technological showing off. It respects players' intelligence while guiding them through challenges. These qualities don't age because they're not dependent on technology. The 3DS remake in 2011, developed by Nintendo EAD and Grezzo, demonstrates which elements needed updating and which remained timeless. The remake upgraded graphics significantly, rendering everything in higher resolution with improved textures and models. It added quality-of-life features like touchscreen inventory management and gyroscope camera control. The Water Temple was modified to make Iron Boots equipment easier to access. Boss battles gained indicators showing weak points more clearly. Yet the core game, dungeon layouts, puzzle solutions, enemy encounters, story progression, remained untouched. The remake improved the presentation and interface while preserving the fundamental design, suggesting Nintendo believed the underlying game was still sound. Reception to Ocarina of Time 3D was overwhelmingly positive, with many reviewers calling it one of the best video game remakes ever made.
Critics praised how the improvements removed barriers of entry caused by age while maintaining what made the original special. This reception suggests that Ocarina of Time's innovations hold up when given modern presentation, but the original presentation shows its age. The game design is timeless, the technology isn't. This is perhaps the healthiest way to view Ocarina of Time in 2025, as excellent design trapped in dated technology, where remakes can liberate that design and make it accessible to modern audiences. The question of whether Ocarina of Time is underrated as an innovation becomes complex because the game has never lacked recognition. It won countless awards, consistently appears on greatest games of all time lists, and influenced virtually every 3D action-adventure game released afterward. If anything, Ocarina of Time might be overrated by players whose nostalgia colors their perception of how the game actually plays today. But its innovations, true innovations that solved unsolved problems and established lasting conventions, are genuinely underrated by players who take those systems for granted without recognizing their origin. Z-targeting is such a standard feature in 3D action games that younger players might not realize there was ever a time when combat in 3D didn't work that way. Context-sensitive controls are so ubiquitous that players don't notice them until they're absent. Hub world structures connecting distinct regions are so common that the design feels obvious in retrospect. These innovations have been absorbed so completely into gaming DNA that their revolutionary nature is invisible to anyone who didn't experience games before they existed. Ocarina of Time's greatest innovations are underrated precisely because they succeeded so completely they became invisible. The game's influence extends beyond specific mechanics into broader design philosophy. Ocarina of Time demonstrated that 3D games could tell emotionally resonant stories, create atmospheric worlds, and maintain tight pacing across long adventures. It proved that transitioning beloved franchises from 2D to 3D could work if developers respected the series' core identity while embracing new possibilities. It showed that innovation and accessibility weren't contradictory. Games could introduce revolutionary systems while remaining intuitive to play. These lessons influenced not just adventure games, but the entire industry. In 2025, Ocarina of Time occupies a unique position. It's not the perfect game nostalgia sometimes remembers. No game is. Its camera has issues, its controls show age, its graphics are crude, and it lacks modern convenience features. But it's also not a relic interesting only to historians. The core game design, thoughtful dungeon puzzles, deliberate pacing, emotional storytelling, atmospheric world building, remains engaging. The innovations it pioneered became so fundamental to 3D gaming that their revolutionary nature is easy to overlook. Playing Ocarina of Time today requires meeting the game where it exists, as a brilliant piece of design from 1998 that solved problems that needed solving and established conventions that endure. Is Ocarina of Time's innovation underrated? The answer is yes, but not in the way the question implies. The game isn't underrated in terms of recognition, it's consistently celebrated as one of gaming's greatest achievements. It's underrated in the sense that its specific innovations have become so standard, so expected, so thoroughly integrated into modern game design that players don't recognize how revolutionary they were or how much current games owe to them. Every time a player locks on to an enemy in a modern game, they're using a system Ocarina of Time pioneered. Every time context-sensitive controls seamlessly interpret player intent, that's Ocarina of Time's legacy. Every time a game uses music to enhance atmosphere, paces progression deliberately, or structures dungeons as spatial puzzles, Ocarina of Time's influence is present. The game deserves recognition not as a perfect, timeless masterpiece that plays as well today as it did in 1998, that's nostalgia talking. It deserves recognition as a perfectly important game that solved fundamental problems, established lasting conventions, and influenced every 3D action-adventure game developed since. Its innovations are underrated because they're invisible, absorbed so completely into gaming that they're taken for granted. And perhaps that's the highest compliment an innovator can receive, to create something so successful it becomes invisible, so foundational it's assumed to have always existed. Ocarina of Time achieved that, and whether players appreciate it while playing the game today or not, they're experiencing its legacy every time they play a modern 3D adventure.